Hello everyone and welcome to this session on Donorfy opportunities. We're going to be looking at the application of opportunities for major gift fundraising. Just to introduce myself, so I'm Janet Ormerod and I'm one of the Donorfy partner consultants running a firm called Nahira Consultancy. My background is in fundraising, so I have experience of trusts and foundations and major gift fundraising, and we'll be applying that to the session today. Before we start, I'd like to thank some Donorfy users who helped in the preparation of the session. So thank you to Nikki from Family Support Work, David from Hampshire Cultural Trust, Sam from St Martin in the Fields, and Will and Mital from Music Makers. So the format of the session is going to be a mix of some theory, some slides, and then we'll be dipping into Donorfy to look at the actual application. So we'll get the screen share rolling. And to start off with talking about the characteristics of this type of fundraising. So compared with what we might call mass fundraising, which is raising smaller amounts from larger numbers of people, the approaches are more targeted, more bespoke. We've got smaller numbers of prospects, but more detail in terms of information, background, and processes. Strong emphasis on relationship management and the involvement of what I call influencers. So these are people who may not be prospects in their own right, but have a relationship with a prospective donor. Typically, we're talking longer timescales, and there's an element of follow-up through stewardship and reporting at the end of the process. So it's a circular process. Key concept is what I call the pipeline. And the idea here is that we've got a number of prospects on the left-hand side. And these would be potential funders that we've already looked into to some extent. And we're feeding those almost as a funnel into the sequence of stages. So we're going to cycle these prospects through. We're going to do some more research. We're going to cultivate the relationships. And ultimately, we're going to make an ask or an application to a trust, and out the other end pops our major gift, hopefully. I've called it idealized because you'll all know that this looks very linear, but actually there could be loops back in the process. People might drop out at an earlier stage. You might get a small gift to start off with and need to go back again to cultivate the relationship for that major gift. But another point to make is the quality of the prospects that you're feeding in on that left-hand side will directly influence the likelihood of a major gift. So the more accurate you can get in the research and the profiling of prospects, then the more likely you are to get funded. And so the ratio, the number of prospects you need compared with receiving gifts would be much lower. So in relating the use of a CRM system to support all those aspects of fundraising, I've picked out these 4 aspects, and essentially these are the agenda for the session today. So we're going to start by looking at that all-important profile and background information on your prospects. Then think about how can we manage the processes involved in those stages in the middle. Then how can we get good visibility of the work that we're doing, so monitoring and management. And finally, looking at the follow-up and feedback processes. So number 1, we look at profile information. How can we find that magic potential funder amidst the mass of people who we might know about? What makes a good prospect? So these 3 facets are very helpful in defining whether a prospect is going to be a good match for the approach that we're making. I'm sure you're all familiar with this idea of capacity, propensity, and connection, these three aspects. So capacity being obviously wealth, or really the ability to give. Propensity is about existing attractions, so whether the funder has an interest in the sorts of things that we're doing would be attracted to supporting our cause. And then connection is about those relationships. Do we have a link with the potential, with the prospect? Can we reach them so it's not a cold contact, but we've got someone perhaps who's got a relationship with them already, or they're already relating to our charity. Now, these three facets may be applied more typically to individuals, so major donor fundraising, but I think could also be applied potentially to trusts. It's really a matter of defining what we mean by these three aspects. And I just want to quickly have a look at some suggestions for defining capacity, propensity, and connection. This is thanks to Music Masters. Will and Mital have shared this. So you can come up with some scorings for capacity. Got some examples there. So some values, potential funding. Propensity, we can define, for example, a score of 1 is very little or no awareness, 5 likely to turn into committed donor. And similarly, for connection, 1 would be we don't really have any connections with that funder. 5 is that they're deeply connected with our organization. And one of the values of doing this sort of exercise is that it brings in a level of consistency to the process. So what kind of information is going to help us build up these scores? So first of all, looking at trusts, I'm going to let you just read through that slide. Note this isn't just about background information, but also some element of urgency. For example, if the trust has an application deadline coming up. And then secondly, information about potential individual donors, major donors. There are similarities, but a few differences. So we may want to hold more personal information about the individual. But we're still interested in things like potential links with our cause and those all important connections through social and other networks. And just to describe this role of connector, I found this very valuable concept in major donor fundraising, is that there are people who typically are very well networked potentially with wealthy individuals. And especially if you're fundraising in a geographic area, if you can identify who these connector roles are and build a relationship with them, then they can potentially bridge you, create links with the donors in their network. So although the connector is not necessarily a funding prospect, there's somebody that you can cultivate and can be very valuable to the organization. So I'm now going to have a look on Donorfy at the different areas that you can hold this sort of information. And I'm going to start off looking at a funder record. So this is the MH Trust. And I've added to the profile page this tile called Prospect. And you'll probably know that if I hadn't added that, if I clicked on Manage, there would be an option down there of Add Prospect Information. So I've already done that. And here's the information that then I can put on the record. There's your capacity propensity connection scores, and very neatly Donorfy tots them up to give you an overall research score. You can add things like overall funding deadlines. This could be trustee meetings, for example. So for trust, we can put a range of potential gift sizes. We've got a chance to add the next application deadline. And we've got some boxes look a little bit like tags, but they're especially for opportunities. So funding preferences and funding locations. And we can adapt those for our own use. We've got a free text box there. We can put a little bit of background in. So that's your prospect tile, but there are some other areas you could use. So scrolling down, you could use some additional tags to hold the kind of information we need. I've got some examples there. So financial data, whether this funder has given to us before, I've got an auto tag set up there. Perhaps whether they've attended any of our previous events. Funding interest, so this is less about the criteria of the funder themselves and more about how they might match what we need funding for. So this charity has a project called Green Transition and thinks that the MH Trust might be a match for that project. And finally, trust type. So we've got family trust in there. And there are probably other examples of how you could use tags to hold this extra information. Another thing to think about is these influencers and connectors. This is where you can use Donorfy connections. So I've added in here, we've got somebody who is a trustee who we perhaps know. And I've also added another connection type of influenced by. And that may be useful also for major donor development, where those personal relationships are so important. So you could use this connection type specifically for major gift development. And another option you've got then is to apply this connection strength as well. So that indicates the strength of that relationship. And we'll come back to that, looking at how you can create a list, a connections list. Other information that's useful is, we touched on it already, but financial information. So the little gift dashboard here gives an idea of how much they've given before and when. And here's reference to the donor pyramid. Now, this you can now customize to your own requirements. And we'll go and have a quick look at that. So if we look on the home page of Donorfy, you're probably familiar with that donor pyramid there. The idea being that it places numbers of donors into levels of giving over a period of time. And you can now customize that for your own needs. Let's look at how you can do that. Go into settings, configuration, and select donor pyramid. You can see there that you can decide what those bands represent financially and also what period it's going to be covering. So going back to our MH Trust constituent. So this is a trust, and the information on the prospect tab is slightly different to that for major donors. I suggest that you could also, for major donors, add perhaps more detail about them, their personal information under research notes. Or another idea would be to set up an activity type. So perhaps on the timeline of this of a major donor funder, you could add a specific activity type of something like donor profile and build up information on that. Notice also on the prospect tile that you can add a brief solicitation plan. So this could be just a summary, could even a couple of sentences. So I put there, speak to trustee who attended the event. So maybe our trustee contact, Reg, came to one of our events, gauge interest in a further application for our green transition project. Okay, so having got all that information recorded in these various places on Donorfy, how can we then use it to get information out and to find out, to segment and categorize our prospects? So I'm going to go now to the opportunities menu area. And those of you watching live may not recognize this. Those of you watching in the future will hopefully be familiar with it, but there is a tab here called Prospects. And the idea of this, it works in a similar way to the Opportunities tab, but focusing in on this type of information. So we've got the usual filters on the left-hand side here. And the sorts of things that you can filter on include who is actually responsible for the funder. You can bring in these funding locations and preferences. Moving on down, it's a bit bigger. The individual scores for capacity, connection, propensity, and then the total score. And also the pyramid levels that I mentioned before. So you could be filtering on all prospects within one or more of those pyramid levels. Lifetime giving, so that's total transaction amount. And some relation to when did you last create an opportunity for the prospect? When is the next application date? So I've just applied a couple of simple filters on this. I've selected trusts as my constituent type, and all trusts who are fund in the southeast and have a criteria involving the environment. So that's brought me back these three trusts here, and I've added a few columns to display, but many other options that you could use to display information. So hope you can see this is a really powerful way to kind of slice and dice your prospect information, and you can output the information as a report, as with all these dashboard screens that you can see using the cloud symbol with the arrow. And this is going to help you with planning and prioritizing your approaches. So another thing I just wanted to cover briefly, which I touched on, is that connection information. So if I go into lists, I've got set up here a connection list. So you could, in a connection list, use that connection type that I mentioned of influencer and pull in some other filters. So there's just a simple example here, the connection strength. So that was that scoring from 1 to 5 is a certain amount or greater than a certain amount. And that's given me 3 relationships there. So this could be a way for you to identify that network of influences that you've got, as well as your prospects, and who they are influencing, and some information about that relationship. Okay, so just in summary, options for profile information, you've got the prospect information tile there. That's going to give you a lot of scope for adding background information. You also can add tags, connections. You can use the donor pyramid. And to then pull out that information, we've now got the prospect dashboard. And you could also use a connections list. So what are your next steps? You need to identify who you're going to approach amongst your prospects. And that could be based on things like likelihood of support. So you could be analyzing the research score, for example. You might be looking at deadlines for application, for example, for trusts. Maybe you need funding for a particular project. So you're trying to find funders that match that project. Or you could be inviting some individuals to a cultivation event. So you're working out who you're going to invite to that. So now we're moving into the process of the pipeline, where you're actually going to make approaches and manage those. And as you can see, it can feel a bit like juggling a lot of balls at a time. And the sort of things that we want to manage here are, for example, you can read it there, what action is needed? What are we actually approaching funders for? What is the ask? We're going to be involving other people in that, and doing a whole lot of recording of task, actions, activities, applications, approaches, and doing some follow-up. So in Donorfy, I'm going to start off by looking at connection types. So if we go back to the opportunities area, and into settings. So now we're thinking about making an actual approach to our prospective funders. And we're going to set up an opportunity which is going to contain the stages involved in that process. And here you can see a list of opportunity types. And we're just going to click on grant application to show you what that contains. So we've got this sequence of stages that have been defined, and these can be customized for your organization. If I just click on research, one thing to point out is we've got this definition of maximum days in stage. So we want to keep an eye on how long a funder has stayed within a particular stage, and if they go beyond that amount of time, we want to be able to see that, and we'll see how we can track that later. We can also set up some tasks that get generated as soon as the funder enters this stage. And also we can, for example, with the stage that represents a successful outcome, we can update the outcome of the opportunity. So we're ticking that box and saying that's going to be a positive outcome. So let's say how this can be applied for an actual funder or prospect. We go back to that example I gave earlier, the MH Trust. And if I scroll down to that prospect tile, you'll see that there's another tab there called Opportunities. I've set up an opportunity already. If you wanted to add a new one, you could click on the Add button there. So if I open the opportunity, let's have a look at the things we can do there. So we can identify who is making the approach, who's the responsible for this opportunity. How much are we approaching the funder for? What stage are we currently at? We can define if it's an approach for a particular campaign or money for a particular fund. We can add some dates. So expected close date is when we expect to finish the whole process and get a result. But we can also add a deadline date. So that's particularly good for trusts if you have an application to make. We can put in a forecast percentage, and that's going to feed into our prediction of how much we might receive from the funder. And we can add some notes under there as well. Thinking about those relationships, we can put an opportunity contact. So this, for trust, this could be the secretary of the trust. For a major donor, it might be that connector or influencer that we're adding in. So once we've added this detail and saved the opportunity, we get some extra tabs appearing. This is where we can put in the detail. So all those actions, follow-up, recording, whether you've had a conversation with the funder. Each opportunity has its own timeline, and that's going to record automatically if you change a stage. You can also add your own activities on there as well. And all the information on this timeline gets copied onto the timeline of the funder. Notice at the top of the opportunity, you've got a summary there, the current stage, the amount that you're approaching for, and the days that this opportunity has been in this stage. So in summary, what you've got on this opportunity, the details are, it's a dynamic information related to the actual approach. So the actions, the tasks, the follow-up, who's doing what you're approaching for. Now we're going to have a look at how can you monitor and manage these processes. How can you get information back out that helps you understand what approaches are you making. You may have quite a lot of these opportunities set up, and it can be quite hard to sort of see the wood for the trees, as it were. So we're going to think now about monitoring and management. And so here's a set of questions that we might want to be able to answer and set up our system so that we can answer them. I'm just going to let you have a read through those. So we've got a couple of areas of Donorfy that are really going to help us with this. One is the overview of opportunities that you can see in the opportunity menu. We'll look at that in a bit more detail in a second. And secondly is this Kanban view. That gives us an idea of which opportunities are in what stage, and some sense of how long they've been there. So let's go back onto Donorfy and we'll head to the opportunities menu again. And this time we're on the tab called Opportunities. And I'm going to look at the list view on here. And this is a little bit similar to the prospect area we saw earlier. But each of these rows represent an opportunity. And we've got, again, a set of filters down the left-hand side that we can use. So it's a very visual representation of where we're at. We can select all opportunity types if we wish. We can filter on things like campaign, fund, whether the opportunities are closed or open. And also we can home in on opportunities for that we're responsible or somebody else is responsible for. And the kind of information we can display includes things like stage, close date, ask amount, number of things that we can pull in. So the information that we've got within those opportunities, we can see visually in this area. If you select a single opportunity type, so let's go for grant application, you get an extra filter of stage. So you could home in on everything within perhaps the submit stage there. Another way of visually looking at your opportunities, if you do select a single opportunity type, you get the option of the Kanban, we call it the board, it's like a Kanban view. So your opportunities are within their stages. If we scroll down at the bottom, there's a count and a total value for each stage. And this is where you get a visual of whether the opportunity is within the timing that you set. So when we looked at opportunity types, you can set a default length of time within a stage. And here you can see green is obviously they're okay for the moment, but red means that the opportunity has gone beyond the length of time that you put as the default for the stage. So those are two ways of looking at your opportunities in kind of visual sense. And the feedback from the review group was that this is probably one of the most useful areas because it very quickly gives you this sort of snapshot. You can home in on a smaller number of opportunities by setting those filters on the left-hand side. You've also got the chart option on the right there. Let's have a look at that. And we won't look at pledges for now. We'll just look at opportunities by stage. So because we've selected a particular opportunity type, we get that option. So these are our grant applications, and we've got amounts within the different stages. And we can apply either the forecast amount or the actual amount there. And we can also look at opportunities by the expected close date. Similarly, using either forecast amount or the actual amounts. But what if the question you want to ask, the thing you want to find out, is not covered by these visuals? So another option you've got is that of the opportunity list. And we'll dive into that. So where you might want to use an opportunity list, let's just have a look at that first off. Things that you can't access through those preset filters. It could include things like other profile data. So those tags that I mentioned, those additional tags. Things like financial statistics and using a range. So whenever you're going to use a range of something, often you will need to go into an opportunity list. And that's particularly relevant for dates. So you might want to inquire, all trust opportunities with a deadline date in the next 3 months, perhaps. That would be one example. I've got as an example here, it's a bit similar. So this is an opportunity list, and I've asked for open opportunities that are grant applications where the submission deadline is in the next 12 months. There's my result. Other examples might be if you're working with individuals, which major donors have a score higher than a certain amount, say 10, who have an interest in supporting our particular welfare project and have supported us in the last 2 years. So you're pulling in some extra financial data there. Or which individual prospects attended our annual dinner last year and are currently being approached via an opportunity. So that represents information about managing the pipeline, managing the stages of the pipeline, and reporting, monitoring, and managing that. So this final section, we're going to have a quick look at monitoring and follow-up. I'm going to start by talking about pledges. So it could be that an opportunity has been closed and has been successful, but the funder is not going to give the grant perhaps immediately, but maybe pledging to give at a certain date. This is also relevant for, say, multi-year grants from trusts. They perhaps pledge £30,000, but it's going to be £10,000 a year. And so in Donorfy, you can manage this scenario by creating pledges linked to an opportunity, and you can add a task which is going to prompt you to follow up, because you can imagine this is a 3-year time period. That's a long time to kind of keep in mind what you need to chase from a funder. And you can also track your pledges and view them through reporting. And there's some extra processing where you can effectively convert a pledge into a transaction. So just quickly on screen, this is an example of an opportunity pledges list. Before we look at that in detail, let's just look on Donorfy at how pledges work. So I've got another opportunity set up here. It's called this is for an individual funder, Sam Clyde. And we've cycled this funder through the process, and happily we've reached a successful outcome. But this funder has said they're going to pledge that £20,000 over a period of time. So what I've done is add the first pledge in there. We can put the amount, the date we're expecting that, so that's July this year. We can also add some default transaction coding, so payment method, product and fund. And the reason for that is you can see here that the pledge can be converted to a different status. So you convert it to invoiced when you invoice the funder, for example, and also to paid and create a transaction from the pledge. In the opportunities dashboard area, you've got one more thing to show you there for pledges. So if we look at all opportunity types and we look at the chart, you can see there you've got a view of open pledges there as a chart display, both pledged and invoiced. You can of course select particular opportunity types to view, so that's just our grant applications that we're viewing there. If you want more details, similarly, you can go to a list. This is called an opportunity pledges list. And I've got a simple set of filters set up there. So we're looking at all trusts, and the pledge is expected before the 1st of April this year. So, and the status is pledged. So really, this is a chase list. Pledges that should have come in and now overdue, and I can show things like the pledge amount, the data, and the date that it's expected. Other types of follow-up and feedback might be that if you've had a grant from a trust, that they are going to look for a feedback report, and a couple of options to set that up could be that you use another opportunity type. If it's quite a complex process with a series of stages, that could be a good way to do it. If it's a simpler activity, simply prompting to do the job, then a combination of something like a task and maybe a custom activity. Stewardship is about continuing to develop the relationship, typically with individuals. Ongoing applications would be for trusts. So there is this sense of you've got this cyclical process going on where you've identified your prospect, you've applied, hopefully you've been successful, and now you're going to look to the next approach. So you could be creating another opportunity, or again, the number of opportunities you create, I would argue, keep them reasonably small. So that would be another tip. Is might be tempting to create an opportunity for every single prospective funder. That could get quite crowded, quite complicated. So it could be that you use a task to prompt yourself, maybe after a period of time, that you're going to set up another approach, and then you're going to pursue that activity at that time. And then really importantly, it's likely that once you've reached the end of a cycle, you've had a positive results, that you need to update the status of your prospect. So it could be that their scoring needs to go up, so they get a higher research score. You may have some additional information to add to their profile. So just to sum up and to finish, here are some points about the strategic benefits that a system like Donorfy, a CRM system, should be able to give you in relation to these fundraising activities. So you should be able to know who your prospects are and their characteristics and the likelihood of support. The system should enable you to track and manage approaches, and that's through this idea of pipeline management. Should allow you to forecast what's going to happen. So you've got your crystal ball and you can see you're predicting results, and you're putting some values on those, you're putting some forecast percentages. So you can look ahead at what you're likely to receive. And that includes amounts that are being pledged as well. You should be able to assess how successful your major gift fundraising has been. That relates to the idea of you're feeding a certain number of prospects in the start of the process and getting gifts out the other end. So if you've had to approach a vast number of prospects to get the amount you've received, that's less efficient and effective than a small number of well-researched, well-targeted prospects. And finally, you can use Donorfy to log the results, to update your prospect list, and to continue with your donor stewardship. So if you'd like any more information, please do get in touch with me, and I'd like to wish you every success with your major gift fundraising. with Donorfy.